Hello Horror Hounds. In the build-up to Universal's new Mummy movie and the start of their dark universe, we've already looked at the 1932 Universal classic The Mummy starring Boris Karloff. Now it's time to skip forward. It's Hammer's The Mummy. Boris Karloff's movie gave Universal Studios 4 sequels to The Mummy, 5 if you include Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy. Jimmy Sangster on scriptwriting duties for Hammer really distills all of those movies down, putting Abbott and Costello to one side, in a formula that has previously worked gangbusters for Frankenstein and Dracula, taking an existing historical successful franchise from Universal Studios and turbocharging it. Hammer's go-to team of the day are all present and correct. Jimmy Sangster on writing duties, Peter Cushing as the lead, Christopher Lee as the villain, and behind the camera, director Terence Fisher. His master shots are gorgeous, sumptuous, dripping with colour and detail that your eye can roam around like a painting. Steady, statesman-like directing, establishing shots so that when you infrequently cut to a close-up, it has that much more impact. And when you cut to a scene where the camera is unexpectedly canted to show the deranged state of a character's mind, it's even more striking. And the villain of the piece, well, that's up for debate actually. Again, plundering from the Universal sequels, the Mummy is actually a golem-like figure under the control of a third party, rather than, as Imhotep was in Karloff's version, the master planner, manipulator, the actual protagonist. But the Mummy himself in this movie, Caris, named after the Mummy in the Universal sequels as well, is the first mummy to feel dangerous. He's energetic, he's methodical, he's brutal, he's single-minded and ridiculously strong. Unlike the Boris Karloff movie, he's on screen for more than just the first 10 minutes or so. And unlike the Universal sequels, he's not just a lumbering, limping fool. You know, everyone knows now that you can outrun the Mummy at a light jog. And he kind of became ridiculous because the level of threat that he posed in the Universal sequels waned and waned and waned. This is not that Mummy. This is the Terminator of mummies. You see that in the action of Caris's kill scenes. First up, first to desecrate the tomb of Karnak is Stephen Banning, and he's locked in his padded cell, and like a setup to a gag, the guard tells him just before locking him in at night, don't bother screaming, no one will hear you. It's only a few seconds later that Caris is outside the barred windows, just prizing open the bars as if they were nothing, pulling the grating off, climbing into the padded cell. Where is there to go? There's nowhere to go. This is the real stuff of primal nightmares. I mean, I'm talking saber-toothed tiger at the mouth of the cave type primal. The second victim, so much more impressive, as it is unexpected. No build-up, no musical cues, just coming at the tail end of a conversation scene as one character moves from a study into a hall to go upstairs to bed, and the huge double oak doors behind him just smash open as Christopher Lee batters them down, strides from the back of the set straight towards the front, grabs the guy by the throat, and I shouted out, I exclaimed, bloody hell, this Mummy gets shit done. And Peter Cushing, as you would ever expect him to be, is dashing, urbane, he's vibrant. In the early movies like this one, he's so full of vim, so full of life himself. You can't really put a price on what he brings to the screen, but what Christopher Lee does in this film is quite extraordinary. He's playing dual roles here, imbuing each with a subtlety and a craft that are perhaps not even on the page of Jimmy Sangster's script. Firstly, he's Caris the High Priest. in an extended flashback, intoning the litanies over the death of his forbidden love. So his dialogue is all essentially bland litanies and hasts and nows and all of this kind of stuff while they're going through the mummification process. But his eyes and subtle expressions just washing across his face show his barely hidden grief. And 4,000 years later, as the mummy, probably even more subtle because there's no dialogue. The performance is almost entirely physical, and it speaks the way he moves of an ancient body come back to life, reanimated after thousands of years. It also speaks of a body forced into animation and motion at another person's will, and perhaps the mind inside that body doesn't want to be doing these things but has absolutely no choice about it. And it's in those eyes the glimmer of understanding and the glimpses of humanity, from the man he was to the golem he's now become, the puppet under someone else's control, that makes you realize that his torture from 4,000 years ago is still ongoing. The women in this are even less well served than in the Universal movie, it has to be said. At least in the 1932 movie, Zita Johann was one of the players in the movie. The character of Isabel, Peter Cushing's wife, is all but forgotten by him and the movie until a coincidental similarity between her looks and that of Ananka, Caris's thousands of year old lost love, is noticed. The men aren't even now love rivals fighting over this woman. Cushing's character is fairly cold and distant towards his wife, kind of forgets that she's around and tries to send her off, even though she's his ultimate salvation, whilst Ananka's mummified body, at least whilst Imhotep in the Boris Karloff movie was kneeling by her sarcophagus attempting to resurrect her, Ananka is basically shipped off to the British Museum and never seen of again. And I have to say, I miss the exotic setting of Egypt from the Boris Karloff mummy movie, and the implied languorous sort of hypnotic vibe that created. The move to England unfortunately makes the film seem much more comfortable and familiar rather than in a foreign exotic location. It looks, once we move back here, like any other Hammer movie to a certain degree. It's also part of a strange decision. Whilst the Universal movie was set in the then present day of 1932, this movie is set at the end of the 19th century. A decision I don't understand, but one that Hammer would continue to do by placing horror in the past, be it a Victorian past or a medieval past or some undisclosed past. It also, unfortunately, means that the investigation into the murders is barely underway before everyone concerned concludes that it must be the strange foreign chap that's just moved into these parts, and all fingers start to point at him. It's slightly more unfortunate as well that is actually the case. Imagine how much more interesting it would have been if the eternally reasonable and logically minded, cool, calculating Peter Cushing had to deal with all of these events whilst in Cairo, surrounded by a culture and people that don't hold to his rigid scientific principles. So as we move from stately, creepy, deathless Boris Karloff to unstoppable killing machine Christopher Lee, it seems that the trend when representing the mummy to the public is to up the action, and so it shall continue. And this will be the evolution of the mummy when next we look at the Stephen Sommers directed Brendan Fraser mummy. But before we go, as ever, because I'm not like the Pope of opinions, I'm not infallible, I like to bring you some alternate viewpoints that I've taken from other reviewers from the Internet Movie Database. The first one comes from Michael Elliott, and he says, incredibly slow-moving title creature chases Peter Cushing through the swamps. I hadn't seen this one since I was very young, and it was every bit as boring as I remembered. It actually took me 4 shots to make it through because it kept putting me to sleep. Christopher Lee looks good as the Mummy, but he doesn't do too much with the role. Cushing is usually wonderful in anything, but he's rather mediocre here. The ending packs a nice punch if you can stay awake that long. Beautiful locations and sets though, thank you Michael, it's almost as if you hadn't watched the film. And the final review from a reviewer called Armand from Romania, and presumably writing in English as a second language, attains a level of poetry to my ear. The story, the performance, the atmosphere, all at high level. A classic horror who preserves the virtues of genre and who can be brilliant model for theme. It is more than an old movie, but a lesson about exploration of a subject with precision and delicacy. Archaeologists, discovery of a tomb, error and revenge, and interesting manner to do force to a lot of nuances. A film who can impress or seduce, not only for the clear story, that is a basic point, but for the manner to create terror, and for the tools, far to be extraordinary, to give sense to a well-known subject. A story like many others, but a little wise, perfect refuge behind the wave of contemporary adaptation of a special theme. I'm not entirely sure what Armand means, but I think that's quite beautiful.